This week on the agenda saw rising hate in the Western world, new policy approaches from Ontario's Progressive Conservative Party, increased scrutiny over Toronto Mayor Rob Ford, angry American voters, and the moral costs of drone warfare. The Agenda's Week in Review begins with author Doug Saunders and debunking the myths of Muslim immigration. Let's go through some of these in the book. You call it the myth of the Muslim tide. And here are what, in your view, are some of the common misconceptions over Muslim immigration. Let's go through them and I'll get your views on this. Muslims will become the majority in Europe sometime during the 21st century. That's what a lot of people think. What do the facts say?
That's at the root of a lot of these things. That's one thing that is unquestionably not based on truth. The population growth of Muslim immigrants is converging very quickly with that of the societies around them. At most, a couple European countries could have close to 10% Muslim populations by the middle of this century, but at that point peaking. The United States, maybe 2%. Canada, probably peaking somewhere just above 6%, and so on.
The anecdotal evidence, though, that you hear people talking about suggests that Muslims have a lot of kids, and that they will be the majority at some point soon. How can you be sure that that's not going to happen?
Two things. First of all, the countries they're coming from are seeing the fastest falling birth rates in the world. Iran went from 7 children per family in the 1980s to 1.7 now, lower than France or Britain. And other countries like United Arab Emirates and Lebanon and Turkey and Bangladesh have seen similar dramatic falls. And immigrants have most of their kids after arriving. This was true of Roman Catholics, Eastern European Jews, Sikhs, so on. Generally, you have a lot of kids after you arrive. Your children have far fewer kids. Their children generally have the same number of kids as everyone else around them.
Okay. Issue 2. Muslim immigrants are guided by a religion which is more ideology than spiritual faith. Yes or no?
No. And I'm not saying that because I'm looking at the scripture and reading the Quran or anything. Because if you read the holy books of the 3 Abrahamic religions, you would become convinced that they are all extremist and dangerous if you took those words literally, and if any believer did. So the question I'm looking at is not what's in the holy books or what are the radical imams saying. It's what are people actually doing? Are they displaying a loyalty to the religion, and so on. And Muslim immigrants tend to fall to the level of religiosity of the society around them. Muslims who go to France, a fifth of them become atheist, and only 5% of them attend a mosque. Muslims who come to the United States, about half of them worship every Friday, which is exactly the same rate as devout Christians, and so on. So generally, and their loyalty to the civil institutions tends to be, if anything, somewhat higher than among non-Muslims. There tends to be a sort of gratefulness at having arrived. Are there exceptions? Sure, but generally speaking, the Muslim immigrant is not being guided by the religious teachings, is not following them.
Issue 3. Muslims are on the side of terrorists. Yes or no?
The support for the types of violence that are committed by terrorists is lower among Muslims than among non-Muslims. There's a study that gets thrown around quite a lot in these books and blog postings and so on, saying that 7% of US Muslims say they support violence against civilians if the cause is right, which, to be frank, alarmed me when I heard that, until I actually looked at the study, which showed that 24% of non-Muslim Americans support attacks against civilians if the cause is right. We should be asking ourselves why so many fewer Muslims and non-Muslims are supporting this type of violence, probably because they're the main victims of this type of violence.
Jens Martin, let me bring you in from Geneva, Switzerland at this point via Skype and ask you, is there any question in your mind but that there is a rise of hate in Europe these days?
I wouldn't say it's just a matter of hate, because I think it's much deeper. When we started this study a decade ago, my friend Fredrik Stjernfeld and I, we started actually studying the civil war in Bosnia, and we asked ourselves, traveling down there, what initiated this hate? What gave rise to this segregation of the society when the communists lost power in Bosnia? And that was the fact that the political system was based upon an ethnic division. The ethnicity followed the religious lines, the Christian Orthodox, the Catholics, and the Muslims. after these studies, we took an interest in studying how does the very mystique word multiculturalism function, let's say, in a model society for multiculturalism. And then we took the model of Malaysia as what we call a hard version of multiculturalism. And there you see the same division of society. You see a Muslim group, and Chinese group, and an Indian group. And this, when you organize the political system along ethnic lines, it will sort of petrify the system, and it will segregate the system, and it will segregate people. And I think beyond hatred, before hatred, I think it's necessary to focus on what segregates us in society.
Let's be a little bit careful here about what we say. Do you think that there is an intent to incite hatred among, let's say, for example, conservative radio talk show hosts in the United States?
Absolutely. And
as opposed to just getting ratings, which is what most of them are all about.
Absolutely. And I think that also exists here in Canada. And that just happened recently on September 5th when one of these people, such as a Rush Limbaugh, but a Canadian version named Ezra Levant, went on live air and for 7 minutes insisted on referring to the Roma community as gypsies. And
you know what? I got it here. Can I read the thing?
Sure.
Stand by one, since you brought it up here. Here's how the Toronto Star reported on this just a couple of weeks or a week or so ago. In a recent video segment vulgarly titled "The Jew versus the Gypsies," conservative media pundit Ezra Levant went on a diatribe about Roma refugees in Canada. Quote, "These are gypsies," he tells us, "a culture synonymous with swindlers. The phrase gypsy and cheater have been so interchangeable historically, that the word has entered the English language as a verb. He gypped me. Well, the gypsies have gypped us. Too many have come here as false refugees, and they come here to gyp us again and rob us blind as they've done in Europe for centuries. They're gypsies, and one of the central characteristics of that culture is that their chief economy is theft and begging." Okay, that's Ezra on Sun TV. Well, we often have to deal with uncomfortable subjects here, so let's just deal with first things first. Is any of what Ezra said true?
Absolutely not. This is a complete racist stereotyping, and exploitation of negative stereotypes that exist about the Roma community. And it's been very easy for people to exploit these stereotypes for their own ends, especially people in influential positions.
I think one of the things that I find troubling, even in our own discussion, is that much of the time when we deal with these issues, we don't actually make distinctions. And I think we're sort of skirting around some of those distinctions. So there is a real difference between this long-standing discourse, whether it's about Roma, let's say, or about Jews, or about blacks, or whatever the case may be, and the way in which that ends up resulting in actions or hate crimes. It seems to me that one of the things that we ought to do is to make a distinction between stereotyping, the kinds of enduring images and ideas that we have about outgroups, others, within our society, and prejudice, the ways in which those things end up becoming internalized over the course of time, and discrimination, the ways in which those things can then impact the way people are responded to either socially or legally. None of that's really quite the same thing as racism. The one doesn't necessarily, you can have enduring stereotypes about a group. The Anti-Defamation League's polling, both in the United States and in Western Europe, clearly indicates that there's a fairly high degree of ongoing stereotypes about Jews and about Judaism. That doesn't necessarily mean it's going to translate into actions within different contexts. So I think the other thing that we really need to talk about is not only the way in which there's been a kind of inflated rhetoric around ethnic groups and about what causes that, but also what exactly is it that's going on in the contemporary context that sometimes makes some people act on some of those ideas. And I think if we get to that, we'll really have begun to get at the roots of the issues that you wanted to raise for us tonight.
Let me ask you this, because repeatedly, the mayor takes issue with journalists like yourself, like myself. He has a few, I guess, friends in the media. Some of them aren't as kind to him as perhaps they once were. And there are his backers who say, John, the likes of you, the likes of Ivor, you're just picking on this mayor, that he's being unfairly scrutinized. Agree?
Well, I mean, you know, if you can't stand the heat, get out of the kitchen. You know, he's a political leader. He has to be scrutinized. And
but is he being held to a different account by journalists?
No, I think that he creates a lot of the problems. He is his own worst enemy, and he has stepped in it so often in ways where he could have easily avoided the problems. The whole conflict of interest charge is a classic example. He had the votes to carry to set aside that fine. He didn't need to stand up and talk to it, and we wouldn't be talking about whether he's going to be mayor 2 months from now.
Ivor, is this a pile-on by us journalists?
I don't think journalists actually enjoy a pile-on as much as it might seem from the outside in.
Fair point.
I think it's probably fair to say that many were not predisposed to like him coming in. But at the same time, I think people are now really eager to find something positive to talk about in this situation, because nobody likes to be put in a position of having to pile on, and yet the news keeps coming.
Karen, what do you think? Because the journalists are going to defend themselves and their craft, so they're a little bit biased.
You know, I think if we start talking again about the city issues, about how we're going to pay for transit, about how we're going to streamline our processes at City Hall, if we start having those discussions, then there will be less of a pile-on effect on the mayor's behaviors. But absent those discussions, and then when you know, again, the weigh-in, when you pull an industrial-sized scale and you park it outside of City Hall and you pledge to the universe that you're going to lose weight, to your point, you need to be disciplined enough to lose the weight. And there's not, nobody asked him to do that. He did it himself. That was his own initiative. And so to suggest that the media was somehow piling on him because he didn't meet his targets, I think is actually unfair, because that was something that he himself set up.
And in that specific case, when he ended it, he complained that it was
Right.
it had become a media event.
Right.
Well, it was a media event by design.
Well, it was designed to be a media event, and again, that's the only time he ever spoke to reporters or showed up for any media. So all the other issues of the day became discussion points when he was stepping on the scale. So it all cascaded, and to your point, it didn't need to. It could have been a great news story. The entire city was behind him.
If he'd done 6 of the
Right.
Chicago business trips, the Chicago business trip is
Right.
great,
Yeah.
right? That's what he should be
Where he
doing.
is right now.
Yeah,
Where he is right now.
it's mayoral. He's got a whole bunch of people from Bay Street with him. It's great. If he'd done that 6 times instead of, you know, stepping into it 6 times and causing these, you know, unnecessary problems for him, we would be having a completely different discussion.
Okay, let me ask you this. What if he stepped in it, as you say, 6 times, but also went to Chicago or did something equivalent 6 times? Would we still be talking about the stepping in it?
Well, no, I think it speaks to the issue of discipline. I mean, John has advised, you know, ministers, cabinet ministers, and you need a certain discipline. You are given huge amounts of power over large organizations, and you have to have a disciplined approach. It's like, you know, to use the football analogy, you call the play, you play the play, right? Instead of getting, you know, sidetracked by lots of melodrama.
John Matson, let's ask for some political advice, free advice for the mayors in Chicago. Maybe he'll watch us online, I don't know. But what would you tell him now? Advise him.
Well, I would firstly, if you think about what people put him in there to do, it was to restore a sense of, you know, if you will, common sense to the city that people thought had lost that kind of common sense. And what that means, I think, is doing everything that he's succeeded in doing on the financial side of the agenda, but it means having the discipline to spread that out to many of the other activities. I mean, the transit agenda was a terrible example, I think, of where there was an inadequate attention to discipline. The fact that broke down, the way in which it broke down, that's the kind of thing that cannot be repeated. But it's the requirement of stopping the manageable mistakes. I mean, I will pick up the cudgel. I think that when he was first elected, there was a whole lot of people who hated him so much ex ante, like right from the beginning, that they were looking for him to make a mistake, and they were going to enjoy his mistakes with it, that kind of unique, yeah, exactly, that unique sort of desire to see him fail. So I think it started that way. The problem is when you're in that situation, you're not supposed to give them so many things to pile on about, right?
With the American presidential election just weeks away, voters seem divided and angry. To help us get behind the fury, we're joined now from Washington, D.C. by Bill Schneider, Distinguished Senior Fellow and Resident Scholar at the moderate Democratic think tank, The Third Way. Hello, Bill. Welcome to the program.
My pleasure to be here.
Bill Schneider, is it surprising to find out that a man running to be the President of the United States thinks that 47% of the electorate lacks personal responsibility, by implication is lazy, are victims, and basically rely on the government?
Yes, that's the answer. It's very surprising. He obviously thought this was, it was a private event, it was a fundraiser, but you know what? In politics today, in virtually every walk of life today, there isn't anything that's private. People are walking around with these cell phone cameras and they can record everything. So no one, particularly a politician, should ever assume that anything is private or off the record.
And interesting though, today Romney, stood by what he said. He said it may have been ineloquent, but virtually stood by what he said. Democrats, of course, see this as extremely damaging. How damaging do you think it is to Romney?
I think it's very damaging. It's something like the charge made against John Kerry back in 2004 when he said, I voted for the $87 billion before I voted against it. That confirmed the damaging stereotype that he was a flip-flopper. This confirms a very damaging stereotype about Mitt Romney, that he's out of touch with ordinary Americans, which has been a stereotype about Romney for a long time. But this makes it even worse, because not only does he sound out of touch, he sounds disdainful of ordinary Americans. He essentially is calling about half the American electorate moochers. They're all mooching off government, and he doesn't have anything to say to them. I was at the Republican convention. There was a lot of hatred, contempt for Obama. These people essentially portrayed Obama as not just out of touch with Americans, but also as someone who was un-American. There were T-shirts people were wearing that said, I am pro-American and anti-Obama. Well, what does that define Obama as? It means that they think he's anti-American. The theme of the convention was that he doesn't get it. He's anti-free enterprise. They kept saying, we built it, meaning we understand free enterprise. He doesn't, because he's not a real American.
Well, let me ask you, because Bill Clinton's implication is that, the Republicans have the domain, the mood of being hateful and angry, but are the Democrats hopping mad as well?
Not this year so much. I think Democrats are disappointed with Obama. They're frustrated. They certainly don't, they don't hate him, of course. They're Democrats. If they have any view of the Republicans, it's something like contempt. That the Republicans are so out of it, they don't get it. They're so consumed by their hatred that they're completely out of touch with ordinary Americans. That doesn't mean that Democrats are incapable of hatred. I covered the 2004 election when Bush was running for re-election. I can assure you there was plenty of hatred among Democrats for President Bush in that election, just as there is for President Obama among Republicans right now.
Well, so let me follow up on that, because we hear a lot these days talk about, the politics of mean, that the politics are getting nastier, it's getting personal. But you're saying this kind of hatred, this kind of contempt has been around for a long time? It's nothing new?
Well, there is something new about it. It's now greater than it ever was. We all remember there were Clinton haters in the 1990s. They even impeached President Clinton. There were Bush haters, I just mentioned, in the 2000s because of the Iraq War. And now there are Obama haters. But there's some evidence out there that the partisan divide has gotten bigger and bigger. The hatreds have gotten more extreme. The Gallup poll shows the distance, the differences between Democrats and Republicans. The polarization has gotten bigger and bigger over the last 20 or 30 years. I teach a course, and a student asked me once, is this the most divided we've ever been as Americans? And I had to remind him, well, once we did have a civil war, and three-quarters of a million Americans were killed in that war. But I would say that this is the most divided the United States has been since the Civil War.
Here is from your discussion paper, Tim. Unions must adapt to the changing economy. They are important players in our economic future. Unfortunately, some have so lost focus that they're now doing things like contributing union dues to the student protesters in Quebec. This kind of behavior is enabled by the extraordinary powers granted to union leaders by government. Because all unionized employees must pay dues or be fired, the union doesn't have to respond to their wishes or needs. We think that should change. Okay, that's the background. What do you want to do about it?
Well, here's the big issue. I mean, this is about jobs. And the challenge Ontario faces in 2012 is that this mighty engine of job creation that we've always believed Ontario to be has sputtered to a halt. We're in a different world in 2012. than in the 1940s when many of these labor laws were brought in. And no business today would be caught using a typewriter or pneumatic tubes. They wouldn't be caught using rotary telephones. So why are we using outdated labor laws in the 1940s? Our plan's comprehensive. You mentioned earlier a new plan for energy. We'll have more on jobs in the economy, including tax and regulatory reform. But a big part of it, Steve, if we want to compete in an increasingly competitive world in 2012, we have to modernize our labor laws, more labor flexibility to create more jobs and build our middle class.
So if a union represents workers at an existing workplace and the company wants to hire more people, you say they should be allowed to without those workers joining a union. Have I got that right?
Yeah, paper says give people a choice. I mean, when you look around, I know that we've had the Rand formula since, what, 1946,
Better
I think.
Explain what that means, the Rand
formula. The
Rand
formula was a decision, I think, to do as a Chrysler strike in Windsor in 1946. It basically mandated everybody in a workplace under collective agreement would have to be part of the union. Now that was 1946.
And not even Mike Harris touched the Rand formula.
Although, you know, the Common Sense Revolution was 1994. We did make some big labor changes. I think it's time for the next round because the world is different even in 2012 than 94. But back to my point with respect to what this all means. When you look around the world, United States, United Kingdom, most of Europe, Australia, New Zealand, workers can actually opt out of a union. I actually think it is un-Canadian to say to somebody in a workplace, if you don't join the union, you're fired. How is that possible? How does that represent Canadian values in 2012? Give them a choice, and you know what? That will also make the unions more accountable to the workers they serve.
Charlotte Yates, it's all about choice. What do you say?
Well, first of all, I think you're mistaken. It's not actually true that when you have the Rand formula, you have to join a union. What you have to do is pay union dues. So in that sense, that's quite a big difference because if you have to join a union, it's a closed shop. If it's Rand formula, you have to pay the dues. Why do they have that? It's because by law, unions have to bargain for all the members of a bargaining unit. So as a result, they absorb the costs of bargaining, grievance, representing those workers.
But he'd let them
And
opt
as
out.
a result, well, exactly. And so you'd have a free rider problem, which is one of the reasons why the Rand formula was ordered in 1946. But there's a bigger set of issues at play here because the connection between job creation and eliminating the Rand formula is just not a tenable one. Nor is it tenable to say that you will build a middle class as a result of the right to work kind of policies that are being proposed by the progressive conservatives. And in fact, we have enough experience in the United States to say that 11 out of the 15 states that have right to work laws like being proposed have the highest poverty rates in the United States.
A bunch of things we got to unpack there, but let's start with this. What's wrong with a situation where if somebody's hired in a place that's already unionized and they don't want to be in the union,
they don't have to be in the union,
and they don't want to pay the union dues, what's wrong with saying, okay, next time there's a collective agreement, all the people who are in the union get all the new benefits that have been negotiated, and you didn't want to be in the union, you don't get the benefits. What's wrong with that?
Theoretically, that's a possibility. It becomes a very chaotic system. It makes for internal tensions. It makes for competition within the workplace, which actually means, in effect, you're banning unions from that workplace because, in effect, what you're saying is that the workers who have voted or, in fact, chosen through a democratic process, because we've got to remember that unions don't just walk into a workplace and announce we're unionizing. In fact, they have to go through a period of either voting in a high proportion of the number of workplaces they have to vote for a union, or where there is already a union, it was in some form democratically made part of that. So in that sense, what you're saying is, notwithstanding the fact that the majority of workers chose that union, they in fact don't have the right to bargain effectively because you're going to let people be either free riders or you're going to let them on a day-to-day basis decide that unions should represent them. It's too chaotic. It's destabilizing for the workplace.
Gregory Thomas, destabilizing for the workplace. Is it?
No, I think experience shows in other economies in Europe as well as the United States that companies, operations operate with unions and with members and with employees who aren't members of the union and don't pay the dues. It's a challenge, but the workers and their employers make it work, both in the public and in the non-public sector.
Charlotte also says that there's no connection between having a more flexible workplace and having lower unemployment numbers. She says it's actually worse. What do you know on this?
Well, I think the data are all over the map, but what we know from reading the newspapers in Ontario is that employers as varied as Volvo and Daimler and Caterpillar and Xstrata are shuttering operations in Ontario and moving them to other jurisdictions, whether it's Mexico or the Midwestern United States or Quebec or Western Canada.
And what percentage of an inflexible labor market would be accounting for in those decisions?
Who knows?
Who knows? Anna, where were you coming from on this?
Well, you know, any attempt to bring reform to labor is welcome. We always look to our leaders for new ideas. I have reservations about the paths, the 7 paths here at 2 levels. One is that, you know, this relationship between moving union dues and economic growth is kind of simplistic. Employers come to Ontario for all kinds of reasons. Natural resources, proximity to markets, consumer demand, Canadian dollar, the value of the Canadian dollar, and so forth. Labor flexibility or inflexibility is there in the top 10, but it's way down the list. So I think that the claim that if we change the RAND formula in Ontario, why we would be flooded with manufacturing jobs, I think is a bit of a stretch. And if there are any studies, I'd like to see them. I personally think that there's selective, people look at selective evidence so they can find that.
Drone strikes reinforce what I consider to be an illusion, a dangerous deception that we can somehow counter terrorism through war, through military means. And the evidence suggests otherwise, that the use of force often is indeed something that is used by the extremist leaders, by the recruiters for these terrorist groups to mobilize more support in the supposed jihad against the United States. And there's a lot of testimony to this. And plus, we've been fighting the Taliban now for 11 years, and by all accounts, they remain very strong, perhaps stronger than ever. General Petraeus himself calls it an industrial strength insurgency. The use of military force is not an effective tool against terrorism. Terrorism is a political problem. It has to be addressed through political means. And the more we use force in this manner, the more we reinforce the warped image of the United States that is being perpetrated by some of the extremists who have indeed, as you said, declared war against the United States.
Let me get Michael Lewis's view on if there are any alternatives here. If the government in its wisdom has decided it doesn't want boots on the ground in a particular place for a whole host of reasons, and it's decided that the ethics of drone strikes are not what they would like them to be, what's the alternative?
Well, the alternatives, at least for the people in, for example, Waziristan and other of the federally administered tribal areas in Pakistan, their choices are either the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, or the Pakistani military, or U.S. ground troops, or drones. I mean, those are really the 4 choices, because if nothing is done, the Taliban and Al-Qaeda are in control of that area of the world. They are not, by all accounts, particularly popular with the civilian population there. But, as I say, the alternatives are the Pakistani military. And if you look at the Swat Valley campaign that the Pakistani military conducted against the Taliban in 2009, that displaced over 1 million civilians, because they use heavy artillery, aircraft, armor, tanks, everything. And they were not very discriminating, and as I say, they displaced over 1 million of their own civilians to do that, to try to get at roughly 3,000 to 4,000 Taliban fighters. Now, boots on the ground, if we have U.S. Special Forces who have operated in Pakistan from time to time, they may be more discriminating, but they also come at night and they kick your door down. And that was a huge source of friction between us and the Karzai regime in Afghanistan. He got to the point where he said that is a deal breaker. If we don't have veto power, if we don't have control over whether there are going to be night raids in Afghanistan, we're not going to let you stay. We are not going to cooperate. And so that is very viscerally unpopular with a lot of the civilian population for that reason. And that leaves drones as being the most discriminating, the least interfering version. Now, if you want to say we shouldn't have war at all, we should cede the area to the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, you can make that argument, but if we are not going to do that, drones are the alternative that I think the majority of the civilian population is most comfortable with.
Jamil, if it's not boots on the ground and if it's not drones, what's the alternative?
Well, you know, I'm not a military expert, but I know something about democratic institutions and civil liberties, and I think it doesn't make sense to have a program of this kind that isn't subject to more stringent public oversight. I mean, we don't know who it is that we're killing. We don't know the standards that the government is applying. We don't know who's making the decision to pull the trigger. We don't know how the government is interpreting the most basic principles of international law. All of that is hidden from the American public and the larger world. And I think that it's a very dangerous thing. I think that there are a lot of people out there who think that who trust President Obama with this power. They trust the Obama administration, for rightly or wrongly. They think that this power will be used wisely by them. But the power obviously is going to be available to every future administration, every future president, and with respect to every future enemy. And you need to make sure that there are institutional constraints, institutional checks and balances, and those just don't exist right now.
Janice?
So there's 3 questions here on the table, and let's just take them apart for 1 minute. First one, if it's not drones and if it's not boots on the ground, what's the alternative? So that's really a question about, do drones have any impact on an insurgency? And the evidence is really mixed. And the best evidence we have from comparative studies of insurgencies over a long time, Steve, is it's actually force and diplomacy working together that make a difference. Talking alone usually doesn't do it, and force alone doesn't do it. But to say only talking and no force, that historically has not led insurgents to decide that they would get into serious negotiations. So that's one. The second is, well, we don't really know who's targeting, and we don't know the rules. Well, we've never known the rules with respect to airstrikes, frankly. There are general principles of law, but when you give a pilot a target, a real-life one who flies over the airfield, it wasn't transparent to the public what the targeting rules.
It's a military decision.
Yeah, it was always a military decision. So we don't really we can't really distinguish the drone problem around that. So what's really at the source of the unease? And here's what I think it is. The real worry here is that it's easier to use these. Because you're not going to risk a pilot. You're not going to risk one of your own. You're not going to risk a pilot being captured. So the tendency to use them is greater. And that's, I think, the fundamental difference here, which distinguishes drone warfare from other kinds of warfare. It's wars made easier.
This is a subject we'll need to return to. Eli Lake, I want to thank you for being there on the line in Washington, D.C. You can read Eli in Newsweek and the Daily Beast. Jamal Jaffer from the ACLU in New York City. We're always happy to have a Canadian on this program, even if he's in the United States. David Courtwright from the University of Notre Dame in either Notre Dame or South Bend, Indiana. What's the difference anyway?
It's just the city right next to the campus.
Gotcha. Okay. Michael Lewis on the line via Skype from Northern Ohio University in Ada, Ohio, and Janice Stein from the Munk School of Global Affairs here in our Toronto studios. Thanks so much, everybody, for a terrific debate. And that is the Agenda's Week in Review. You can see all of those programs in their entirety on our website, theagenda.tvo.org, or on our YouTube channel. That's youtube.com/theagenda.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.